Every morning for 3 years, Sarah Bennett brought fresh bread to Thomas Reed's farm. The routine began long before the sun fully cleared the jagged edges of the Wyoming Territory's horizon, back when the air was still sharp enough to frost a person's breath and turn the sagebrush into rows of glittering silver. Sarah would wake while the stars were still pinning up the corners of the night sky. She would tend to her own stove, knead the dough until her wrists ached with a satisfying warmth, and bake a loaf that carried the very scent of home within its crust. When it was finished, she would wrap the warm, golden loaf in a clean piece of checkered linen, tuck it carefully into her wicker basket, and set out along the well-worn dirt path that cut through the valley between their properties. It was a walk she could have done blindfolded. She knew every dip in the dirt, every twist in the creek bed, and exactly where the wild sweetgrass grew thickest against the fence line. Thomas was always awake. By the time the gravel crunched beneath Sarah's boots, he would be out by the pump, washing the morning's milking grime from his hands with freezing well water or mending a broken piece of leather harness on the front porch. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and weathered by decades of high plains wind, with silver threading heavily through his dark, thick hair and deep-set, quiet eyes that seemed to take in the world without needing to say much about it. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, a man shaped by the heavy timber he hauled and the stubborn soil he broke year after year. "Morning, Sarah," he'd say, wiping his damp, calloused hands on a rough canvas rag. His voice was always a low, steady rumble, a sound that felt as grounding and permanent to Sarah as the earth beneath their feet. "Morning, Thomas. Brought today's loaf," she'd reply, her voice a soft contrast as she stepped up onto the wide wooden porch. They would sit together on the sturdy pine bench he'd built himself with mortise and tenon joints, meant to last a lifetime. Without a word, Thomas would disappear inside for a brief moment and bring out 2 tin mugs of black coffee, boiled strong enough to wake the dead. They would share a few thick slices of the bread right there, cutting it with his old horn-handled pocket knife, the white steam rising between them and vanishing into the crisp frontier air. In those quiet dawn hours, they talked of simple, essential things. The current price of alfalfa down at the railhead, the stubbornness of his old lineback dun mare, the subtle threat of an early autumn frost, or how her winter squash was faring against the grasshoppers. It was a comfortable, seamless routine, as predictable and necessary as the turning of the seasons. To anyone watching from the distant county road, they looked like two pieces of a puzzle that had long since slotted perfectly together, defying the vast, lonely emptiness of the Wyoming Territory. As the months bled into one another, that daily half-mile walk mapped the changing face of the frontier. In the bitter heart of winter, when the north wind howled off the mountains and buried the valley in 4 feet of drifting snow, Sarah would put on her heaviest wool cloak, wrap her boots in burlap, and trudge through the white drifts just to make sure Thomas had something warm to eat with his salt pork. On those mornings, Thomas wouldn't wait by the pump. He would be down the path with a wooden shovel, clearing a trail to meet her halfway, his breath pluming like smoke. When spring arrived, turning the dirt path into a thick, clinging gumbo mud, they would stand on the porch and watch the geese fly north, talking about the upcoming ploughing schedule. In the blistering heat of the July harvest, when Thomas worked 16 hours a day binding wheat until his shirt was soaked through with sweat and dust, Sarah would leave a jar of cold spring water hidden in the shade of his well house, alongside the bread. On Sundays, they would ride into town together in his unpainted buckboard wagon, sitting side by side on the spring seat, their shoulders occasionally brushing as the iron-tired wheels struck the deep ruts of the road. They would sit in the same church pew, sharing a hymnal, their voices blending in a quiet harmony that required no explanation to anyone else. The townspeople, of course, watched them with a mixture of curiosity and simple frontier logic. They assumed Sarah brought the bread purely out of Christian charity and neighborly duty. After all, Thomas had been a widower for 5 long years, living completely alone in that big, quiet house since the fever had taken his wife, and Sarah was a 29-year-old unmarried homesteader who lived alone and knew the hardships of a solitary life. It made perfect sense that a good woman would look out for a lonely neighbor who lacked a woman's touch around the house. The community, however, was beginning to lean heavily into their business. The valley was growing, and with growth came gossip. "You bring that man bread every single morning, Sarah," Martha Higgins said one afternoon at the Mercantile, her voice echoing slightly over the barrels of salt flour and bolts of calico. She adjusted her spectacles, looking pointedly at Sarah's woven basket. "You know, people in the territory talk. A young woman spending her early hours on a bachelor's porch. Well, folks have opinions. He's a lucky man to have you fetching and carrying for him, but a woman has to look out for her own name." Even the old men smoking pipes outside the livery stable would nod as Thomas rode past. "Reed's a fool if he don't put a ring on her finger," they'd mutter into their grey beards. "But he's old enough to be her uncle, and he knows it. A man don't like to ask a young bird to cage herself in an old nest." Sarah ignored the comments, keeping her head held high, but the weight of the town's scrutiny began to fray the edges of her quiet world. She turned her mind entirely to the small details of his days. When she traded her extra butter for supplies, she began buying the expensive, finely sifted white flour from the East, reserving it exclusively for Thomas's loaves so they would be light and easy on his stomach after a hard day's labor. She noticed things that nobody else in the valley did. She saw the subtle hitch in his right hip when he had spent too many hours behind the plow. On those mornings, she would deliberately stretch out their porch conversations, asking endless questions about the weather or the livestock, just to force him to sit on the bench and rest his body for an extra half hour. During the grueling weeks of the late summer threshing, when the sun beat down mercilessly, Sarah would return to her kitchen at noon to bake a completely separate afternoon loaf. She would wrap it in damp cloth to keep it from drying out in the heat and leave it on his cutting board while he was out in the fields, alongside a jar of vinegar-tinged switchel to cut his thirst. On a quiet Tuesday in November, a date marked on no calendar in the valley, she arrived on his porch with a small crock of wild plum preserves tucked next to the loaf. Thomas had looked at it, surprised, mentioning he hadn't tasted wild plum since his boyhood homesteading days in Iowa. He had completely forgotten that he had casually murmured that memory to her a year prior during a conversation about fruit trees. Sarah simply smiled, adjusted her bonnet, and asked if he needed his winter blankets mended, never mentioning that she had spent 3 days searching the northern creek beds just to find the last remaining wild plum bushes before the frost took them. It happened on a crisp morning in late September. The morning sun was painting the entire prairie in brilliant shades of amber, bronze, and gold, and the heavy, sweet smell of cured sweetgrass was thick in the valley air. Sarah walked up the steps and handed him the bread as she always did. As Thomas took the linen-wrapped loaf, his large, rough fingers brushed against her palms. A pleasant, deeply familiar warmth filled the small space between them. Thomas took a bite of the fresh crust, closing his eyes in reverence as he savored the taste. "Sarah, I swear, if your baking gets any better, the whole county's going to start showing up on my front porch with their plates out," he chuckled, his voice echoing in the clear morning air. He looked down at the golden loaf, then out toward the main road where a neighbor's hay wagon was slowly rolling past in the distance. He let out a soft, easy laugh, completely unaware of the weight of his own words. "People might start thinking we're married, the way you look after me." Thomas smiled warmly, looking back at her, fully expecting her to join in on the light-hearted jest. But the laugh died instantly in Sarah's throat. The words hung in the air between them, heavy, sudden, and suffocating. Her heart gave a painful, violent thud against her ribs, and she quietly lowered her gaze to her lap, her fingers tightening so hard around the faded fabric of her skirt that her knuckles turned white. The joke, intended so innocently as a piece of friendly humor, sliced clean through her 3 long years of patience. To hear him treat it as an impossibility, a humorous absurdity, was more than she could bear. Seeing her sudden, rigid silence, Thomas's easy smile faded into instant concern. He leaned forward, setting his coffee mug down on the pine table. "Sarah, you all right? Did I say something amiss?" "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice flat and strained. She forced a small, hollow smile as she stood up from the wooden bench, carefully smoothing the front of her white apron to hide the trembling of her hands. I just, I just remembered I left my heavy iron stew pot on the hot stove back home. I need to get back before it burns. Before he could offer to stand, before he could question her further or offer to walk her back down the dirt lane, she was already down the porch steps. She headed down the path at a brisk pace, her head bowed against the morning sun. She left him sitting entirely alone on the porch with a half-eaten loaf of bread, 2 steaming mugs of coffee, and a sudden, cold, and deeply unsettling sense of unease that he couldn't quite put into words. The sudden shift in Sarah's daily routine didn't go unnoticed in the small frontier community, especially by Daniel Harper. Daniel was the town's primary merchant, a 33-year-old bachelor who was prosperous, handsome, and highly respected by everyone in the valley. He was a genuinely good man, honest to a fault in his business dealings at the dry goods store, deeply kind to his aging mother, and genuinely taken with Sarah's quiet strength and independence. Sensing a change in the air, Daniel began finding frequent reasons to visit her small homestead. He would drive his buggy out to her place, bringing her tins of fine imported tea from the east, offering to haul her heavy sacks of grain down to the gristmill free of charge, and ensuring he was the one to walk her home from the church doors every single Sunday. The townspeople were absolutely thrilled by the development. "They're a perfect match," Sarah's friends would whisper excitedly to one another outside the mercantile. "Daniel can give her an easy, comfortable life in a painted house. She wouldn't have to break her back working the soil or handling livestock anymore." Logically, Daniel was the right choice for any sensible woman. He was kind, he was successful, and he had his whole life ahead of him. Thomas watched it all unfold from a painful distance. The first blow landed on a Tuesday morning when the sun rose high over the ridge and the porch bench remained completely empty. Thomas stood by his well pump, staring down the dirt path until his eyes strained against the glare, but no basket appeared. Later that afternoon, when he rode into town to buy roofing nails, he saw her. She was sitting at a small corner table in the town cafe, sharing an early breakfast with Daniel Harper. Daniel was leaning forward, laughing at something she had said, and Sarah was smiling. A genuine, soft smile that Thomas had always thought belonged only to his quiet front porch. A strange, sharp, and agonizing ache flared deep in his chest. It was a cold, bitter knot of jealousy he hadn't felt in decades. The second blow arrived the following Sunday. Thomas stood under the shade of a large cottonwood tree near the church hitching posts, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He watched as the congregation poured out into the afternoon sun. Daniel Harper stepped up to Sarah, his movements fluid and confident. Thomas watched as Daniel held out a hand, his fingers lingering slightly as he helped Sarah up into his shiny, newly painted black buggy. Thomas saw how carefully Daniel adjusted a wool lap robe over her skirts to protect them from the dust. He looked down at his own heavy, unpainted buckboard wagon, covered in dried mud from the creek crossing, and then down at his own calloused, scarred hands. The contrast was suffocating. He felt like a ghost watching a world he no longer had any right to touch. That night, the old farmhouse was louder than a winter storm. Thomas paced the length of his kitchen, the floorboards creaking beneath his heavy boots. He didn't turn on the oil lamp. He didn't want to see the emptiness of the rooms. He sat at the kitchen table, buried his face in his rough hands, and let the darkness press in on him. Every memory of the last 3 years taunted him, the sound of her laughter, the smell of the warm linen-wrapped bread, the way she knew exactly when to remain silent when his mind was troubled. He stayed awake until the stars faded, completely convincing himself that the kindest, most honorable, and most deeply loving thing he could do was to step back entirely and let Daniel win her heart. "Don't be a foolish old man," he muttered fiercely to the quiet night air, his voice catching in his throat. "She deserves a young man's bright future, not an old man's fading twilight. You have absolutely no right to ask her to bind her youth and beauty to your old, tired bones." The next morning, the familiar crunch of gravel finally returned. Sarah appeared on his porch. She looked tired, her eyes holding a quiet, raw vulnerability that looked like it had been forged in a sleepless night of her own. She handed him the linen-wrapped bread, but her body remained tense, and she didn't make any move to sit down on the bench. Thomas took the warm loaf, setting it down carefully on the pine table. He swallowed the massive lump in his throat, knowing he had to say the words right now before he lost his courage forever. "Sarah," he began, his voice rougher and lower than usual, thick with the weight of his decision. "I saw you in town with Daniel yesterday." Sarah went completely still, her dark eyes watching him with an intense, unblinking focus. "Did you?" "He's a good man, Sarah," Thomas said, forcing himself to look her directly in the eye, though it felt like a knife turning in his ribs to do it. "He's got a good, profitable business. He's young, he's handsome. He can give you the kind of life you ought to have in this country. A comfortable life, an easy life, a family of your own. You've spent 3 years of your life looking after an old, worn-out farmer who has nothing but dirt, hard work, and grey hair to offer you. You deserve someone younger, Sarah, someone with a real future." The silence that followed his speech was absolute and suffocating. Sarah didn't look angry. Instead, a profound, crushing, and absolute hurt washed over her features, draining the color from her face. Her shoulders sank, as if a physical weight had been dropped upon them, and her eyes shimmered with a sudden rush of unshed tears. To hear the man she adored essentially dismiss her to another man, to see him so willingly, so logically hand her away because of his own stubborn, prideful fears, broke something deep and vital inside her soul. "Is that really what you think of me, Thomas?" she whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "That I've been spending my mornings here just looking for a comfortable life? That I'm looking for a business or a fancy buggy?" "No, Sarah, I just mean—" "3 years," she interrupted, taking a definitive step closer to him on the porch, her voice gaining a raw, quiet, and terrifying intensity. "I didn't bring you fresh bread every single morning for 3 years because I felt sorry for you, Thomas Reed. And when you made that joke last week, I wasn't hoping people would stop talking about us." Thomas blinked, his breath catching completely in his throat, his heart stopping as he stared at the fire in her eyes. "I was hoping you'd finally notice," she said, her voice cracking with the immense, agonizing weight of the truth. "I don't want Daniel's store. I don't want his money or his buggy or his youth. I want you. I have loved you for 3 long years, you stubborn, foolish man. But if you're too blind or too afraid to see that, then I suppose you're right. I'll leave you to your dirt and your grey hair." She turned sharply to leave, her boots striking the porch boards as she prepared to walk out of his life for good. But the revelation hit Thomas like a sudden, blinding flash of prairie lightning, burning away every single ounce of his doubt, his age, his hesitation, and his fear in a single heartbeat. The world became narrow and completely clear. He moved faster than he had in 20 years. He bolted down the porch steps, his large hand reaching out to catch her gently but firmly by the arm, turning her back to face him before she could reach the dirt path. He saw the hot tears overflowing her eyes, the fierce love and deep, bleeding hurt burning there, and the very last of his reservations shattered into nothingness. "Sarah, wait," he breathed, his voice thick, rough, and trembling with an emotion so vast it shook his entire frame. "I'm an old fool, a completely blind, terrified old fool, I thought. I thought I was protecting you from wasting your beautiful life on a man who's already lived most of his. I've been in absolute agony watching him near you." He reached up with both hands, his rough, calloused, soil-stained thumbs gently brushing the tears from her cheeks with an incredible tenderness. "I love you, Sarah. I've loved you since the first loaf you brought to this porch, but I never, not for one single moment, thought I was worthy of being loved back by someone like you." Sarah's breath hitched, her anger and hurt completely melting away like mountain snow under a spring sun as she looked deep into his eyes and saw the absolute, unshielded truth of his words. "You are," she whispered, her hands rising to touch the coarse fabric of his shirt. "You've always been worthy, Thomas." Thomas pulled her fiercely into his arms, holding her tight against his broad chest, burying his face in the sweet, clean scent of her hair as the morning sun finally broke fully over the wide Wyoming plains, warming them both in its golden light. The following spring, the entire valley gathered at the small wooden church on the hill. They didn't come to celebrate a wedding between Sarah and the town merchant, but rather to watch Sarah Bennett become Sarah Reed. Daniel Harper, ever the true gentleman, stood near the back to wish them well, having gracefully accepted that some bonds were simply meant to be, woven together by time and devotion rather than logic. 2 years later, the morning routine hadn't changed all that much, though the solitary walk between properties was a thing of the past. The morning sun cast a deep, warm, golden glow across the wide front porch of the Reed farm. Thomas sat on the sturdy wooden bench he had built, a few more prominent silver hairs in his beard, but a deep, unshakable, and eternal contentment in his quiet eyes. In his lap sat their infant daughter, a bright-eyed little girl who was currently trying her best to chew on her father's large thumb. The front door creaked open, and Sarah stepped out onto the porch, carrying a wooden board holding a fresh, steaming loaf of sourdough bread, its rich, yeasty aroma filling the crisp frontier air just as it had for years. She smiled down at her husband and her daughter, stepping over to sit closely beside him on the bench. Thomas wrapped one large, strong, protective arm around Sarah's shoulders, pulling her securely against his side as she leaned her head against his shoulder. He looked at the bread, then at his beautiful wife, a soft, deeply loving, and teasing crinkle appearing at the very corners of his eyes. "You know," Thomas murmured into the quiet morning, pressing a warm kiss to the top of her head, "if you keep bringing me fresh bread every morning, people might think we're happily married." Sarah laughed, a warm, beautiful, and ringing sound that echoed across the quiet, vast Wyoming prairie. "Let them talk, Thomas," she whispered, closing her eyes and leaning into his steady, enduring warmth. "Let them talk."